I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Father John Langen, and I'm the rector of the Jesuit community here at Georgetown. And I've been a participant in building bridges, I think, 6 times, several times at Georgetown, and then in Sarajevo and Singapore and Rome. And it's been a very enlightening and enriching experience for me. And I have got a certain amount of experience, but I'm still very much a learner. And I think this is a very important part of the whole process, that there are scholars and learners who turn out to be the same people, and who are also speakers and listeners. Myself, I come to this from the standpoint of someone trained in moral and political philosophy, so that means that especially on the Islamic side, I have an enormous amount of learning to do, for which I'm the opportunity to do some of that in a very congenial, respectful, gracious setting is something for which I'm very grateful. But you've come here to hear 2 rather different speakers. The way in which these seminars have been constructed has usually been, of course, involved a parity between people coming from the Christian traditions and from the Islamic tradition, but also cross-national boundaries and various academic disciplines. We are monolingual in these sessions. Perhaps at some future point we may branch out, but there's a kind of ease of communication which reliance on the English language facilitates for us. The speakers, however, as I say, come from different countries. Phillip Jenkins is originally a Welshman who studied history at Cambridge and now lives in Pennsylvania, where he's professor at Penn State University. And in both cases, he's lived in country of mountains and valleys, highly picturesque and full of independent people. And he has achieved a remarkable global reputation, particularly beginning with his book, The Next Christendom, in which he's directed our attention to the global South and to important changes in the transformation of Christianity that are going on right now and are in many ways accelerating, so that the Christianity becomes a majority Southern religion. He's, however, not confined to spotting current trends, but has just done a book on the Jesus Wars, going back to the 5th century, so that he's someone who has the ability to interpret our long developing traditions in the light of contemporary concerns and social scientific knowledge. The other speaker is Recep Şentürk, who comes to us from the great intercontinental city of Istanbul, where he teaches in the political science department at Fatih University. He holds a doctorate in sociology from Columbia University, has written a book with a title which I think we can more widely appreciate after this morning's presentations. It's called Narrative Social Structure, the Anatomy of Hadith Transmission Structures from 610 to 1505, published by Stanford University Press. So he's today going to focus mostly on the transformation of Turkey as a form of modernization in the 20th century. And I think we'll get some fresh and interesting perspectives on the way in which the struggle between tradition and modernity has been interpreted in our two different traditions in significantly different global and national contexts.
So I was asked to talk on the subject of religious authority and the challenge of modernity. The more I worked on it, the more it turned into modernity and the challenge of religious authority, but bear with me. All societies live by their myths, and if you were to ask, certainly most Americans, many Westerners, about that issue of religious authority and modernity, they would think about particular heroic incidents, and particularly something like the Scopes trial of 1925 as mediated through a film like Inherit the Wind, where the forces of righteousness and knowledge and science put to flight the forces of ignorance and obscurantism. You must understand, I realize that's a very crude system, but I'm dealing with secularism, which is a very crude tribal sort of religion. Bear with me. And it is almost a form of faith. It is a heroic mythology. Obviously, in the defeat of one particular fundamentalist notion of biblical authority, that did not put an end to religion, but it made religion a private matter, that we move into the world of what Stephen Jay Gould called non-overlapping magisteria, that religion is this private business over here, science does this over here, and the two should not mix. Basic to that idea is that the Bible reflects the ideas, the mores, the cultures of a particular era, and except maybe as inspiration, its ability to speak to us today is limited to that extent. Well, obviously, there's a great deal wrong with that image. I mean, the Scopes trial itself is a far more complex matter than I've suggested there. But what I want to do is to look at this struggle, which I suppose revolved around around Scopes, but look at some of the ways in which religious authority is changing in the modern world. And any straightforward narrative of the decline of religious authorities is a very flawed one. What I'm suggesting is it's not necessarily declining, but it is being unmoored from traditional institutions, and it's passing through an era of rapid democratization and decentralization, changing, not declining. So first of all, if there was, if you like, a standard narrative of the decline of religious authority, it would go something like this. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Christianity had Protestant and Catholic traditions, which were divided about the absolute source of authority, whether they found that in tradition or in scripture. Because of political circumstances, the struggle against traditional authority happened in Protestant countries, above all England and the Netherlands, which were more tolerant to dissenting views. The story conventionally would start with Spinoza's Tractatus in the 1670s, which proposed the idea that human reason could and should be applied to any matter of religion. Human beings can and must judge the scriptures. One of the very powerful force there, and one that often doesn't get enough play in accounts of the decline of religious authority, is that of law. Many of the most important people, activists, are lawyers. And if there's a figure I turn to a great deal, it's the great Dutch polymath Grotius, and his idea of natural law, an absolute law that prevails and cannot be overruled or abrogated even by an omnipotent being. It's a very powerful idea. It's the idea which today, for instance, would be used to arrest presidents or generals who have done nothing contrary to the written laws of their particular countries. In the 17th and 18th century, that's actually a very potent idea in judging and assessing the Bible, when people turn to some of the bloody, and genocidal, and warlike passages in the Bible, the destruction of the Amalekites, for example, or those passages about Herem warfare, which begin, show them no mercy, exterminate them to the last man, woman, and child. What did you do with that? You could say it's a mystery, it's beyond us, but the more legal, natural law ideas became influential, the more that became implausible. There's these ideas become prominent in deist writers in England. In 1696, John Toland writes a book with the title Christianity Not Mysterious, or a treatise showing that there is nothing in the gospel contrary to reason nor above it. And as he says, to believe the divinity of Scripture or the sense of any passage thereof without rational proofs and an evident consistency is a blamable credulity. In 1730, Matthew Tyndall writes his book, Christianity as Old as the Creation, which I could, as they say, talk about at great length, but what he tries to do is he takes these ideas of natural law, which he knew about as a judge studying matters of piracy and international law. He applied some of these principles to the Bible and Old Testament, found them gravely wanting, and his principle was that though the literal sense of Scripture be ever so plain, yet it must not stand in competition with what our reason tells us of the nature and perceptions of God. From that perspective, Tyndall was quite capable of condemning what the Bible said. Also very important is the rise of comparative anthropology. During the modernist crisis in America in the 1890s, there's a leading anthropologist called James Mooney who makes the helpful comment that when we look at the ancient Hebrews, they had reached about the plane of our own Navajo, but had not risen as high as the Pueblo. Their mythological systems were broadly similar. So the idea was, if you were looking at primitive peoples with primitive tribes, you must expect primitive violence and primitive codes, and there was no reason for a modern world to accept them. And that, of course, led to ideas of testing the Bible scientifically. If there was a single most devastating passage, it's the one in which Joshua commands the sun to stand still over Gibeon, a passage which only makes sense in light of a pre-Copernican view of the solar system. And from the 16th century all the way through the Scopes trial, that is Exhibit A, in proving that, quote, the Bible is wrong, that religious authority cannot be justified. And of course, Roman Catholics find another source of authority in tradition, and that is another story in the 20th century, how ideas of traditional institutional authority are undermined by a number of other themes, trends towards ideas of popular consultation, democracy, gender rights, and also a sense of trying to restore the primitive nature of the church with concepts of episcopacy, for example, as they might prove then. But the primitive church provides an absolute standard by which to judge. If you want a key turning point there, then it would probably be the 1968 Humanae Vitae, after which many millions of Catholics found themselves able to proclaim themselves good Catholics while defying an explicit papal prohibition. So it does raise the question, if you cannot rely on the Bible, you cannot rely on the tradition of the institutional church, on apostolic succession, what then can you rely? And religious authority ceases to exist as an external force. It can guide the individual in accordance with reason. And so if you accept this narrative, then what you see is an ever greater circumscription of the notion of religious authority. And this idea was quite common again in the Enlightenment. It was Jefferson who, among many other stupid things he said, what was said in the early 19th century. He was writing to a Unitarian minister, and he said that by the time the minister died, probably in 1850 or 1860, he hoped that all Americans would be Unitarians, and religion based on reason and so on. Well, we're not all Unitarians. What happened? What went wrong? Well, the first thing, obviously, is that the notion of the decline of religious authority raises the question of which decline, among whom, where. And if you just take one criterion of biblical authority, for example, which is the notion of creationism, depending on what poll you accept, probably around a third of Americans today accept the idea that human beings evolved from earlier species of animal. Now, you can change the question, but that's basically it. I'm sometimes reminded, Peter Berger said something that I dearly wish I'd said, but I will duly credit him, which is, he says that the most religious people in the world are Indians, the least religious people in the world are Swedes, and the United States is a nation of Indians governed by Swedes. And I sometimes add a corollary to that, which is the New York Times is the newsletter from the Swedish embassy. Europeans might tend to view such attitudes as American ignorance or unscientific nature, whatever. But as Grace Davy, has reminded us, if you look worldwide, it is Europe in its secularism that is the exceptional case. And it's very interesting when you actually look at polls within Europe, how many ordinary people, as opposed to those folks who write the newspapers, really are very conservative on issues of religious authority. What else went wrong? Any religion that is based on scriptures has a natural, inevitable, and I would say permanent tendency to revert at different phases to conservative views of scripture. And I would cite here, you might be familiar with a Weberian idea of sects and churches. In other words, religions are born in very prophetic enthusiasm. Over time, they moderate, they mollify, and they become more world-accommodating churches. However, every so often, people will go back to those founding scriptures. They will go back to those founding models of what the primitive church was, or they believe it to be, and that church will spawn a sect, and the process begins again, and that will continue infinitely, as long as human beings survive. So the idea of a reversion is quite common. In fact, one of the great examples of that comes in the generation immediately after Jefferson's time, when there is a great reversion to very conservative views of Scripture. Interestingly, although the Bible comes under frequent attack as a statement of absolute religious authority, if there is a statement you can make generally about the United States, about Western Europe, it's that people believe deeply and passionately in scriptures and the primitive church. By which I mean that when people try and formulate religious or spiritual ideas in contrast to, in conflict with tired old Christianity, what do? They discover, rediscover, invent, and idealize bogus scriptures, which of course have pseudo-apostolic succession. Look at the phenomenal success, obviously, of the Da Vinci Code, but look at the popularity of pseudo-gospels. How can anyone believe the foolishness of the four Gospels? But the Gospel of Thomas is different, or the Gospel of Mary, or the Gospel of Judas. And there is what I have described as a loving consecration of the non-canonical. that only makes sense if you believe in the notion of Scripture giving authority. It's as if people are prepared to discuss new religious ideas, new spiritual ideas, new cultural ideas, but they insist on being able to root them in a scripture. If I can give you an example, if you're a poet or you know a poet, what is the worst question you can possibly hear? Is that a real poem or did you write it yourself? With scriptures and religious ideas, similarly, the notion is did you write that idea yourself, or does it have a real basis in a scripture? And you will find it in a scripture. And so I suggest that actually Americans certainly, and all these books have done extremely well in Europe. Judas was having its impact in Germany before it ever hit America. People do have this, if you like, cult of the scriptures. Once again, I ask about the question, the decline of religious authority. Where? Much of my work has concerned the spread of Christianity in the global south, in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, where there are very different struggles with the notion of modernity, where there are different traditions. I do not want to hit people over the head with numbers, but the numbers are interesting. Back in 1900, about 82% of the world's Christians lived in Europe and North America. By 2050, that number is probably going to be down to about 18%. By 2050, the number of Christians living in Africa will be about a third of the world's total. It should be around 1 billion people. That will be from 10 million Christians in 1900 to 1 billion by 2050. That's a remarkable story. If you look in terms of the Catholic Church, I talk about the decline of traditional notions of authority within the Catholic Church. Doesn't seem to have affected Christian growth in Africa, Catholic growth in Africa. One more figure, bear with me. In Africa in 1900, there were 2 million Catholics. By 2000, there were 120 million, which, as my colleague John Allen points out, represents an increase of 6,700%, which, as I point out, if you have a humanities background, is more than double. And there is considerable evidence from recent statistics, which is that counts of Catholics in Africa are gravely flawed because they underestimate the actual total by 20% or more. In other words, the church is missing 20% of its Catholics, which might mean they're too busy baptizing them to count them. If you look at global South churches, if you look at churches in Africa or Asia, their concerns, their concepts of religious authority, their debates over religious authority are very different from those in Europe or North America. It is not so much an issue of the struggle with secularism, it is the struggle with other forms of absolute religious authority and the quest for which absolute authority that is. Often with Islam in Africa, with other ancient literate religions in Asia. So the issue is not, is there authority out there? It is, which authority is it, and how do I know? And if you wanted to look at the future of Christianity in a postmodern world, that is probably where it is. That is not necessarily, as I will explain in a moment, a delayed encounter with modernity. It's a different concept of modernity. I would also suggest that when we look at religious authority versus modernity, modernity itself does not come across as it might have done in the popular mythology of the Scopes trial, for example, when the modern was seen as being resolutely objective and scientific and value-free. If there is one thing we have learned from postmodernism, it's that those concepts of being non-ideological and value-free are highly ideological concepts in their own right. A postmodern approach would reject all master narratives, including this one of absolute scientific objectivity. And it supposes a concept of reading and understanding texts, which frankly these days looks very old-fashioned. To say, for instance, that the story of the sun standing still on Gibeon disproves the Bible makes sense if you hold the crudest and most fundamental idea of the nature of narrative and the nature of texts. Were I to look at traditional religious notions of biblical authority, traditional notions of the modern, I think both of them look very much of their time. Interestingly, I've recently been working on this idea of the very violent and genocidal texts that you do find in the Bible and the way Christians have tried to deal with them through history. And if you look at the oldest Christian authorities, their ways of reading actually make very good sense from a postmodern perspective. Back in the 3rd century, for instance, there were heretics who wished to get rid of the Old Testament. And they would say, look at these dreadful scriptures, look at these dreadful accounts of warfare, and show them no mercy. And a father like Origen would, cough politely and say scornfully, well, yes, of course that's right, if you accept that as a literal word-for-word historical reading, but only an idiot would accept things at that sort of level. There are different ways of reading. There's a literal reading, which is what you might call the kindergarten approach. There's a moral reading, and there's a spiritual reading. And you have to see the scripture in the sense of the whole message of the Bible, the whole faith of the religion, and you have to read through the Spirit. Or as we might say these days, the reader is all, the interpreter is all. So when you look, for instance, at all the different allegories and typologies which so dominate early Christian exegesis, they come from that point of view. Augustine had to deal with the same issue, and his view was, every part of sacred scripture had to be interpreted through the Spirit. It had to be interpreted through the believer. And he actually says at one point, he said, he's arguing that what mattered was reading the Bible holistically, rather than as a simple record of past events. Whatever the true interpretation may be, he said, the pious student of the scriptures will feel certain that in the command, in the action, in the narrative, there is a purpose and a symbolic meaning, unquote. And he acknowledges no prescribed limit to the meanings that a, quote, pious student can derive from the text, except maybe the literal one, which might be out of bounds. Again, the reader is all. I also think about the character of Christianity as it expands around the world. One question that you might have heard in conversation is, what is the world's fastest growing religion? And if you're interested in that question, I urge you to look at the Wikipedia page, World's Fastest Growing Religion, which gives you the leading 25 claimants to that title. And one answer, if you wish, is Christianity outside Europe. And the forms of Christianity which are growing most rapidly around the world are Pentecostal, charismatic, and they have a very specific, a particular way of reading the Bible. The numbers here are interesting. The modern charismatic movement, Pentecostal movement, began in the early years of the 20th century. Today there might be 350 million worldwide. And it's quite likely that that number could top 1 billion by the middle of the coming century. This is an important movement. How do they read the Bible? Well, in the phrase of Schleiermacher, it's a feminine reading. It's intuitive, it's organic, it's creative. It's based on creative intuition and immediacy with the text. And once again, it takes the specific text, but then reads it through the eyes of the spirit of faith. And this is always nicely illustrated for me by the woman leader of an African Pentecostal church, who was asked once upon a time in an interview, do you believe in the Bible? Oh, yes, yes, absolutely. How do you feel about the text saying that women should not hold authority over men? And her response was, she believes in the absolute authority of the Bible, but she's also open to the creative movings of the Spirit. And if liberal Christians are often accused of playing fast and loose with the scriptural text in sexual matters, for example, then probably the world's largest, fastest growing Christian movement also does very much the same. But it does get to the issue of how on earth or off earth can modernity challenge that kind of religious authority. But the sun did not move over Gibeon. Well, yes, so. And it is impervious. I would also add one thing which I believe to be something which maybe does not get stressed as much as it could in debates over religious authority. I mean no offense when I say this, because I know there are academics in the room, and I am one. But they have a really bad habit of assuming that if it isn't in the pages of a written book, then it has less authority. Whereas, if you look at religious movements worldwide, charismatic events, charismatic power, not only carries its own message of authority, but serves to justify other forms of authority. And if you write that out of the story, you're missing a very large part of it. One church father was a man called Gregory Thaumaturgos in the 3rd century. And he always shows up in the books as a sort of footnote because he designed a creed which became the basis of the Nicene Creed. Very important. Why did anyone accept it? I'm sorry, what was his name? Thaumaturgos, the wonder worker, the miracle worker, the healer. Also, among other things, the first man recorded in history to have received a vision of the Virgin Mary. If you were to write a history of churches or religious movements in terms of their written texts and written records, without taking account of their claims to miracle and miraculous power, then what you have left is a fairly thin and sketchy account. You know, one point I have made in the past is that in contemporary Europe, yes, the churches might be in trouble in institutional forms, but we are also living through the golden age of Christian pilgrimage. And if you fail to pay attention to that, you're missing a very large part of the story. And these are not particularly postmodern, very, I'm spiritual but not religious pilgrimage. These are really good, old-fashioned, healing shrine-type pilgrimages. So I would suggest that clearly we live in a time of major changes in the nature of religious authority. The laity is a much more informed, educated group. It has radically different expectations about being convinced about science, about gender, about family. Around the world, it is the ultimate buyer's market in religion. But instead of turning away from religion, Christians turning, or would-be Christians turning away from churches, they are seeking out new and convincing forms of authority. And so we have a great boom in what you can call religious entrepreneurs across the religions. People who have most successfully mastered contemporary techniques of media, electronic media, in Pentecostalism, what I call the culture of spiritual spectacle. And and that leads me to believe that as we move into an age of more technology and religion, that a similar pattern will emerge. Now, as you may be aware, if you know anything about the history of the internet, religion took to the internet very avidly, like a duck to orange sauce. And the problematic side of that, of course, is that the kinds of religion that flourish on the internet tend to be hostile to traditional forms of authority. This is something that values peer-to-peer interaction, where any claim will be measured, torn apart, reconstructed in a very short time. But we're not seeing, as I say, a decline, an elimination form of religious authority, but a much more segmented kind of market, and people being more willing to be convinced in different ways. I would suggest, to use an analogy, that this is as great a change in consciousness, the nature of religion, as the coming of the book in European culture in the 16th century. And just as I would say in 1400, it was impossible to imagine what European religion would look like in 1600, because people didn't have the intellectual tools, we are equally incapable of imagining what the world will look like in 30 or 40 years in these terms. Don't forget, the pace of change accelerates very, very rapidly. But all I can say is that religious authority has succeeded astonishingly well in riding out any number of earlier challenges, and I see no reason why it will not survive, mutate, and develop, and even grow in coming decades. And so while I hate to challenge anyone's basic fundamental beliefs or scriptures, I have to go back and say that Scopes trial myth is just wrong, and I will take to disproving that. Thank you.
Islamic tradition is an open tradition. So are all great traditions in the world. Otherwise, they couldn't have survived until today. This is what they need to be able to face the challenges that comes out of social, cultural, and political changes. A great tradition must be open to survive, must be flexible enough to accommodate changes and diversity of cultures, traditions, and geographical conditions. When we look at the traditional authority structure in Islam, we see that it had been polyphonic, with multiple voices speaking for Islam, which reflects its openness and its power to accommodate diversity and change. Modernization has made Islam even more polyphonic. Islam, as you may all know, means submission to the authority of God alone. But this authority is expressed in the Quran and in the Hadith. You have to look at the authority of Prophet Muhammad in order to understand what kind of authority structure Islam established. So when you look at his authority, you see that he had a very humble life, and he defined authority as expressed in one of his sayings, Sayyidul Qawm Khadimuhum. So the leader or the authority in a society is their servant. So this authority was not aimed in subjecting other peoples to one's will, rather than improving their conditions. I mentioned that modernization has made the authority structure in Islam even more polyphonic. So in my talk, I will explore what changed and why in the authority structure of Islam, and where do we head to from here. There is a famous saying in the Islamic literature, traditional Islamic literature, which states, "The kings are the rulers of the people. The scholars are the rulers of the kings, and the law is the ruler over everyone." This is what some scholars call nomocracy, the power of law dominating over all other authorities. And in the present Islamic world, we see changes in the authority structure because there is no king today in most of the Muslim countries. And also, there is no ulama as it used to be in most of the Muslim countries. And again, there is no Islamic law in many Islamic countries because of the secularization. So you can see that the traditional authority structure, which was represented by ulama, by umara, by Sharia, by Islamic law, doesn't exist today. So the traditional authority structure is not intact in our day. Why? We can attribute these changes to colonialization, modernization, secularization, and also the rise of new media, new technology. And now we have a very interesting question in our time. Where does all these changes lead Islam? And this is a very important and great question. We need to look at the traditional authority structure in Islam so that we can understand what changed. When we look at the traditional authority structure, we see Khalifa at the top, representing the highest authority in Islam. However, Khalifa did not have complete authority. There was a check and balance system provided by Islamic law, which was represented by ulama. And in most of the cases, Khalifa was not the legislator. He didn't have the power to put a new law. The ulama had the power of making ijtihad, issuing a fatwa. So the Khalifa had to collaborate with the ulama. So this system was not well structured and systematized before the Ottomans, but Ottomans systematized this relationship between ulama and the Khalifa, which clearly reflects the check and balance system. So the Shaykhul Islam, the highest authority which represented Islamic law, was appointed by the Khalifa Sultan, and the same way the Khalifa Sultan was approved by the Shaykhul Islam. So the Shaykhul Islam had the power to dispose the Khalifa, to dethrone the Khalifa by a fatwa. Actually, one of the travelers who came to Istanbul from Europe, he said in his writing, don't think that the most powerful man in Istanbul, in Constantinople, is the Sultan. There is another man who can dispose him with a line, with a sentence. He is called Shaykhul Islam. But the same way, Shaykhul Islam had the Khalifa, the Sultan, had the power to depose the Shaykhul Islam as well. So no one was given the complete power. Neither the Khalifa Sultan nor the Shaykhul Islam. And historically, when we look at how it worked, 1/3 of the sultans were deposed by a fatwa from the Shaykhul Islam. And likewise, I don't know the exact number, but around 10 Shaykhul Islams were deposed by a firman from the Sultan. So this is how it worked in practice. So the authority of the Khalifa was derived from the authority of the Ummah. Because the Ummah, according to Islamic law, has infallibility, an infallible authority. Because Prophet Muhammad said in one of his hadith that my Ummah would never unite on a mistake or heresy. So the only infallible authority in the Sunni understanding of Islam is the Ummah. But in the Shia interpretation, the infallible authority is given to Imam. So his authority is infallible. So the Ummah, which has the only infallible authority in Islam, elects the Khalifa and makes bay'ah, gives its consent to the power of the ulama. So this is one way of how the infallible authority of the Ummah was operationalized. The second way is the institution of ijma, the consensus of scholars. So this is again another way the authority of Ummah was institutionalized. However, I can say that the infallible authority of Ummah is an issue which is under-theorized in Islamic theology and law. So another meaning of the Khalifa, again, all human beings, they are called Khalifa of Allah. All human beings, they are called Khalifa of Allah, but the leader of the state, the Sultan, he is called Khalifa of Prophet Muhammad. So you can see that human beings, as being created by God, are the representatives of the divine authority over all the rest of the creation. However, the leader, he represents the political authority, religious authority of Prophet Muhammad. That's why it's very important to understand the authority Prophet Muhammad represented, because the leaders who came after him, they tried to follow his example. Of course, they were not prophets. They did not get divine message. And so this relationship is the relationship between Khalifa of Allah and Khalifa of Prophet Muhammad. And Muslims are required to obey the Khalifa. However, Islamic law puts a limit to this authority. There is a famous rule, لا طاعة لمخلوق عند معصية الخالق. So one is, a subject is not required to obey the ruler if it involves disobedience to God. So if a ruler gives a command which contradicts with the rules of Islamic law, the subjects are required of showing civil disobedience. They are not required to obey. And also, Khalifa, the head of the Muslim community, may not have the authority to make ijtihad or to issue a fatwa unless he's a qualified scholar. So this is again a limitation to his power and authority. So ijtihad, making ijtihad, issuing fatwa, these are powers which are reserved only to the qualified scholars. And ulama gain their authority not only because of the knowledge they have, but also there is what's called isnad system. There is a recorded chain of authorities reaching from a scholar to the Prophet Muhammad. This is how they authenticate their authority, by showing that the knowledge they represent is not something they innovated, is not something they produced, but it's a knowledge which they inherited from Prophet Muhammad. So when you study these isnads, the chain of authorities, it reaches to Prophet Muhammad, and from Prophet Muhammad to Archangel Gabriel, and to Allah. So the source of ultimate truth and ultimate knowledge is Allah. So this is how they establish their authority. But of course, it does not mean that the only knowledge is the knowledge which is received as a legacy from Prophet Muhammad, because there is the domain of ijtihad, the producing opinions, informed and qualified opinions. However, one establishes his or her authority to make ijtihad through isnad, through the chain of authorities reaching to Prophet Muhammad. And the traditional diploma, which is given to a graduating student, is called ijazah, which means permission. Permission to give fatwa, permission to educate a legal case, permission to teach and guide others. Islamic knowledge in the traditional times were divided into two categories. This is clearly reflected in the books about the taxonomy of disciplines in the Middle Ages. For instance, Taşköprülüzade divides the disciplines in his time into two categories: those which were based on rational thinking, they include law, theology, and those which were based on intuition or kashf, which is the opening of the heart. So this is what's called tasawwuf. So we had two types of authorities. One authority in the rational domain, the ulama, and then the authority in the spiritual, I shouldn't say spiritual, the tasawwuf domain, or the Sufi domain. They were called Sufi sheikhs, as we know them today. So one is called ilm, knowledge. The other was called ma'rifat, or irfan. We can translate it as experiential knowledge of God. And most of the time, the authority, the scholar, combined both. So when you look at Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, he taught law in madrasa. Actually, this is how he made his living. He was a teacher of law, which is a very rational subject. But when he came to his Sufi lodge, his tekke, he was dictating Mesnawi. So he combined both types of knowledge. This demonstrates the multi-level discourse in Islam. and how they switched from genre to genre, and also the multi-level authority. Because let's say Rumi, Mevlana Rumi, when he acted as a professor of law or as a judge, he had to be very rational and very objective. But when he acted as a Sufi sheikh, he was required to use a different discourse. And in the traditional social structure, the society was divided into two groups, awam and khawas. Awam means those who couldn't give fatwa, who had to consult scholars to get a legal opinion when they wanted to do something. But khawas were the ones who could issue a fatwa, who could educate a legal case. So even the Khalifa could be part of awam, the commoners, unless he's an educated and qualified scholar. And there was also khawasul khawas, the elite of the elite, or the cream of the cream, and those were the scholars who combined the legal knowledge with the Sufi knowledge. And most of the Ottoman Sheikhul Islams, they were great legal scholars, but at the same time they were great Sufis also. The authority of the ulama was a religious authority, political authority, moral authority, legal authority, and an epistemic authority. Sheikhul Islam, he was not only a religious figure, especially in the Ottoman Empire, because he was Minister of Justice, Minister of Education at the same time. All the Qadis, he was head of the Ilmiya class. Ilmiya class, because the Ottoman ruling class was divided into three categories: the army, the bureaucrats, and the Ilmiya, the knowledgeable class. So the knowledgeable class included the judges, the Qadis. And the Qadis, they were governors and judges at the same time. And they were under Sheikhul Islam. So he was Minister of Interior, Minister of Justice, and also he was responsible for the educational system. So Minister of Education. So he wasn't only responsible for the mosques and how people pray there and appoint the imams. So his powers were very vast. However, his authority was not binding in religious issues. That's what I call, polyphonic structure of authority. So, there are many issues around which there have been debates. So Sheikhul Islam gives a fatwa, and other scholars are free to object this fatwa and issue their own fatwa. And the society and the members of the society, they are allowed to choose the fatwa that they think is suitable to themselves. So even though he was the head of the Ilmiya class or Ilmiya group, the group of the scholars, he didn't have power to silence them if they had an opposing view to his own opinions. This is the reason why I call Islamic law an open law. It's open to diversity of views, multiplicity of authorities, which is, it didn't begin with the Ottomans. It begins from the very beginning of Islam. We have four mazhabs, and then we have the Shia school of law, and then others. So even though the Sheikhul Islam has his own school of law, he's affiliated with a particular school of law, he doesn't have the authority to make everyone accept the views of this school of law. What happened, this is the traditional period. We need to understand it so that we can understand what happened afterwards and why. We can briefly say that the nation, or the authority of the nation, replaced the authority of the Ummah. So the nation has been considered the ultimate authority. For instance, in Turkey, it was written in the National Assembly that the nation has the ultimate authority without any condition and limits. So this kind of authority, the infallible authority, and also source of legitimacy for the political authority, in the past belonged to the Ummah. So this is a great shift from the Ummah to the nation. Same way, nation state replaced nomocracy. You know, and nation states had different forms, and they still have different forms. There are democracies, there are kingdoms, there are socialist, capitalist states, there are different states, but they don't follow the traditional pattern of governance, which may be called as nomocracy. So during the 19th century, Muslim world went through process of colonization and also secularization and rise of nationalism. All these things work together to undermine the traditional authority structure. The Khilafat was abolished, and the same way the office of the Shaykh al-Islam was abolished. You know, the collapse of Ottoman Empire is very interesting because it ruled the the majority of the Muslim lands. So kind of the destiny of the Islamic civilization was identified with the destiny of the Ottoman state. With its collapse, many things had to change. But if Ottoman state was one of the many states, its collapse wouldn't influence the large Muslim community in the world. So the Khilafat, the loss of the abolishment of the Khilafat was a great change in the authority structure of Islam. Same way, abolishing the Shaykh al-Islam's authority was also very important change. And during this time, we see a process which may be called a process of centralization of the state's power. So the state wanted to control all the power and did not want any separate authority, did not want a check and balance system. And also the state expanded its authority to the domains of education, law, and other fields which were traditionally controlled by the religious authorities. So this is the underlying process of secularization, because secularization cannot be understood simply a change of mind or a change of ideas. You know, there is a political structural transformation behind it, and this is how it happened in Europe, and it happened the same way in Muslim countries. But in Muslim countries, secularism was understood and practiced as subjugation of religion to political authority. So you can see the best example of this in Turkey. It's commonly misperceived that Turkish secularism is borrowed from France. I think this is not true because in France, religion or the church has autonomy. And religious education is under the control of the church. But in Turkey, religion doesn't have autonomy. It's controlled by the state. And religious education can be given only by the state, not by any other authority. The only corresponding model in the world to this kind of secularism is the former Soviet Union and the China, where religion is completely controlled by the state and its autonomy is not accepted by the state. When we look at the present situation, we see that there are self-appointed authorities. Authorities with a claim to speak for Islam, and they are self-appointed, and the legitimacy for this type of authority comes from popularity, comes from their charisma, comes from successful usage of marketing, instead of expertise or the traditional mechanisms of authentication. The only exception to this is the Sufi orders. And in the Sufi orders, the authority of the Sufi sheikh does not come from his diploma or from election. He's not elected by the members of the Sufi order. In most of the Sufi orders, the traditional authority structure and the mechanisms of legitimacy and also transfer of authority are still preserved. But in the intellectual or the academic community, it completely changed. So today, we don't have isnad or ijazah. Instead, we have a diploma system. And the difference between the diploma and the traditional ijazah is that diploma is given by an institution. So you are a graduate of Georgetown University. So a corporate institution gives you the diploma, the license, to practice your job. But in the traditional system, another scholar, a scholar, an individual scholar, gives you the diploma. So, so this is a very important change in the authority structure. So by taking the authority of giving diploma to the new generation of students and giving it to the institutions established by the state, the authority of the ulama was undermined. But it doesn't mean this system completely ended. It continues. So today we have the university system, which produces academics who speak about Islam. And also we have the traditional educational system, and they also speak about religion, but the mechanisms of authority is different in the university and in the traditional educational system. So in order to gain authority through modern mechanisms of academic education, you go to university, do your master's or PhD, and get a diploma. But to gain your authority through traditional mechanisms, you go and study under a scholar and get your ijazah with the chain of authorities reaching to the Prophet Muhammad. And today we have both of them, although in the beginning, when secular university system was introduced, the purpose of the reformist or the revolutionary was to replace religious authority so that religion disappears. But religion did not disappear, and also traditional religious authority did not disappear. Today they coexist. They coexist and they work together. So today we have madrasas in some Muslim countries, but we also have universities. And they both produce graduates. And they both claim that they are the authority to speak about Islam and to speak for the Muslim community. So the change is not only institutional, but also there is a change in the patterns of reasoning and thinking. With the coming of the modern university, modern Western social scientific thinking was also introduced to the Muslim world. So today we have social scientists speaking for Islam, which did not exist, let's say, 100 years ago. So this is a new phenomenon. So we have traditionally educated scholars. We have scholars who were educated from School of Theology in the university. And also we have social scientists speaking on the issues of religious importance. And in addition to these, we have journalists, TV preachers, and even public singers. So they also have authority because they know how to successfully use the new media. But the traditional authority, they try to adapt to the new conditions, and they try to learn how to successfully use the new media like the websites, internet, and other things. And we see that the mechanisms of social networks change. And as a result of this, the forms of authority, the mechanisms of legitimacy, and the meaning of authority will also inevitably change. And the survival of the traditional authority depends on its ability to adapt to these new circumstances and use the new medium. I believe that they will successfully do so because in the past they did so. The internet revolution or the communication revolution may be compared to the print revolution, and because of its openness, great traditions, including Islam, survived these changes, and they adopted the print medium. And now I observe that they are adopting the new medium of the internet and TV and radio and other things. And this is a process that will continue. And in conclusion, I would like to say that both tradition and modernity are fluid. None is fixed and frozen. And this will continue and a great synthesis will be achieved between the two, rather than one eradicating and completely eliminating the other in the future. Thank you.
Professor Shenturk was talking about the importance of Islam as an open tradition. And I think we will move in that spirit to an open conversation with you putting questions. And if you can come to the center, and please identify yourself by name and institutional affiliation.
My name is Imtiaz Yusuf from Georgetown University. My question is to Rajab. I liked your presentation, but I think there is a crisis of authority going on in the Muslim world. We have many groups who are talking as being authorities of Islam. You have the traditional ulama, you have the televangelists, Muslim televangelists, who are like the Pentecostals, and then you have the Islamists, and you have the jihadists. And the crux of the problem is that today the youth, the Muslim youth, is confused about whose interpretation is the right interpretation of Islam. And this is, I think, what we are talking about. The rise of radicalism, jihadism, and interpretation of Islam. I would like to listen to your view on this issue of crisis of authority in today's Islam.
Okay, thank you. There is something in the Muslim world which may be called authority crisis, but Islam has always been so. You know, in the Muslim world, you always had many schools of law, many Sufi tariqats, and also even in the theology, you had many schools. And today, it increased more. So this is what gives us the feeling that there is an authority crisis. So as I mentioned, even in the Ottoman Empire, it was very structured, powerful state. So the ulama had the freedom to object to Shaykh al-Islam, even to the Khalifa, when it came to religious opinions. So this is sometimes we want to have a homogeneous Muslim community with a single authority. This was not envisioned by Islam, and it's not acceptable by Islam. I think the power of Islam and its ability to survive comes from its openness. Of course, there are some authorities which I touched this issue at the end of my presentation. Their authority is based only on popularity, on charisma, and I think they were not legitimated in an appropriate way. So the issue is how an authority should legitimate itself in our age. So this is what we need today, rather than silencing different voices. We should try to develop objective rules, learning from our tradition, how to keep diversity without letting people slide into extremism. Thank you.
Next question.
Hello, I'm Samira Daniels. I've been interested in the interfaith dialogue for a long time. Picking up on this point of authority, I was intrigued with your reference to Rumi and his dual-headedness in terms of being able to cast something in a poetic, romantic way, and then wearing this other hat. I think that in the debate about in democracy promotion in terms of the rhetoric in nationalism, what has intrigued me is the absence, at least from the Western view, of that kind of Renaissance personality that I think is the hope of any society. And this same thing has happened in our society, and thus through the United Nations and other non-profit organizations, the vocabulary has narrowed, and I wondered what your view, and it has sort of criminalized dissent in the process, in here and in other subsets of. So I wanted you to address that.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very stimulating question. I recently published a book in Turkish. The title is Open Civilization, the cultural, intellectual foundations of pluralism in Islam. And there I claim that the multiplexity of the worldview and the multiplexity of the discourse laid the foundation for pluralism in Islam. So one day, one of my professor friends came to me with two books. He said, either this book belongs to Ghazali or this one. He couldn't have authored both of them. So one book is Miyarul Ilm, which is a book on logic. The other one is Mishkatul Anwar, which is a book on Sufism. So he said, like, either he's a rationalist or he's a mystic. He couldn't have authored both of them. So I mentioned to him about what in Islamic epistemology called Maratib al-Ulum, the multiple levels of knowledge. So Ghazali was a logician. He was like writing logic in a very rational manner, but at the same time he was a Sufi. He was writing another type of discourse. And in the Muslim world, what I call modernization of thought, a transition from multiplicity of thoughts and discourse to a unilayered, like a single layer thinking and thought. So I agree with you that as we leave these multiple levels of discourse, we become reductionist, and our vocabulary becomes narrowed. So we need to readopt this multiplex approach to the existence and to the system of knowledge, and also to the discourse, to enrich it, and also to accommodate different voices on different levels. Thank you.
Professor Jenkins?
I just want to say something very quickly there, which is in the Christian tradition also, we suffer from the problem of historical writing in the sense of academics focus on individuals and they just focus on the elements they like in those individuals. And so if you look at some of the great, if you like, heroes of rationalism or the heroes of very logical religion, these are also great mystics. And, you know, we mentioned Isaac Newton earlier. Isaac Newton spent a huge amount of his time in alchemy and apocalyptic speculation, and in his spare time threw off some gravitational theory. Aquinas and Pascal had recorded these great mystical moments. And, you know, if you want to talk about the father of, if you like, death of God thought in the West, it would be that great German Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who became an assassin attempting to kill the Antichrist. So ideas of mysticism and logic and rationality are much more closely intertwined than perhaps many historians will suggest.
I would add also Wittgenstein, who was not a Sufi, but I think you could tell the same story that about your professor about the Tractatus and the investigations.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
In the back.
My name is Richard Jones. I'm a priest in the Episcopal Church in the States, and I chair the Christian Muslim Studies for the Washington Theological Consortium, a chair that was created last year in honor of Taha Jabir al-Alwani. For Professor Jenkins, you mentioned opinion survey polls as a source of knowledge of current beliefs. How do we know how many people should be counted demographically as members of present-day religious groups? Is it by self-reporting? Is it state statisticians? Is it something a great deal more complex? And it matters here in the United States, it matters in European countries, it matters in divided countries like Sudan.
Sure.
Where do you get your numbers?
Okay, fine. Well, in terms of some of the figures I was using then, I was using the Religion World Survey when I was talking about, for instance, African Catholics. There is Pew data, there's Templeton data, which look at reported religion, which is the only way to get at things in a country like China, for example, which is very, very difficult. There is a source where you can use, which is the World Christian Database, which I do use, but you have to use very cautiously depending on particular countries. You have to know whether and the individual countries they're using. So it's like a basket of different measures. My normal rule is I always tend to take the most conservative estimate. You know, it's famous, for instance, you'll get two churches reporting numbers, and one will use a kind of default system, which is you're not this, you're not this, you're not this, fine, you must be this. And others, for instance, will just include adult full communicants. And you have to know what you're talking about in particular denominations and assess them differently. But particularly with the quote I was using about Catholics then, that was a Religion World survey, and that's a good authoritative social science survey. You are very wise to be cautious, but I'm also reasonably good at sifting the data, and that applies across religions, of course.
Next.
I'm Enver Massoud with the Wisdom Fund, a small internet-based organization. It seems like what you were talking about in authority in the Muslim world is what in organization theory is called authority of position and authority of leadership. Authority of position being that which is inherited, appointed, elected, somehow has some formal basis, whereas the authority of leadership is just some person that achieves authority because enough people listen to them. And the two are always in conflict and exist in all organizations. And perhaps that's the strength of the organization that keeps it innovating and surviving under the different challenges that come to it. So I'm curious, is that terminology used in your literature, the authority of position, the authority of leadership?
Okay, thank you very much. This is coming from organization theory. It's new to us, but instead, sometimes we use Weberian terminology, authority deriving from the office, or authority deriving from the charisma. When we look at the authority structure in Islam, we have both. Both of them. We see them at place. So Shaykh al-Islam represents the authority of the position or the authority of office. He represents the formal authority, right? So the other scholars, they represent the authority of the leadership or the informal authority. So they benefit from each other if there is a mechanism of collaboration. Otherwise, there is a conflict between the charismatic authority, which poses a threat to the formal institutional or positional authority. And I think we have this in Islam because Islamic law, or especially usul al-fiqh, the methodology of Islamic law, sets some rules about this. Your positional authority does not count when it comes to scholarly debate. You and your opponent are scholars, and you talk as two scholars. So your position or your office may be whatever it is. And also, if a mujtahid, it's unlawful for a mujtahid to imitate another mujtahid. So like somebody who's qualified to issue a legal opinion, so if he's convinced that, okay, this is the right thing, he cannot drop his view and follow the view of someone else because he has the office or the position. So this would be wrong and unacceptable. So this is what's called ikhtilaf or khilaf, the diversity or the disagreement. And in Islamic law, there are rules how to accommodate all these views and at the same time maintain an order without letting it turn into chaos. Thank you.
I think this will be probably our last question.
I'm John Milbank from Nottingham in England. I've got just a couple of quick things I wanted to ask about. The first one was the question of whether nomotheocracy is a kind of adequate description of the ancien regime, as it were, in Islam, because at least as I understand it, which is not very far at all, that Islamic law tends to deal with civil law, and that there's a vast area sort of not covered by this where you need political authority, so that this had to be matched by a fairly kind of absolute authority of the caliphate or the sultanate, so that just as in the case of Tocqueville writing about the French Revolution, there's continuity as well as break in the terms of the strength of the the Turkish nation state. It's not just a break, but there's also a certain element there of continuity. And the second question is kind of related to that, and that's a question about the way in which, in your discourse, multiplicity, diversity, plurality seems to figure both as a huge problem and as something desirable, and in some sense as the answer. And I'm wondering how you sort of mediate that. And more particularly, I've got questions about how far specifically in Islam there's a kind of oscillation between what you describe as a formal authority and charismatic authority, whether that's relatively political, relatively religious, and how far also, while these, single people talking in different discourses, this is admirable, but also there's sometimes a sort of gap in mediation that, the really greats like Mullah Sadr and so on tried to overcome. But whether, as it were, between the strong sense of law on the one hand and the powerful sense of the charisma and the intervention of the esoteric on the other hand, that, as it were, the third term would be tradition, and whether, while obviously tradition's enormously important in Islam, whether it's completely central in the sense of sort of when you've got the church, there's somehow a linking of tradition itself to authority, so that, as it were, tradition becomes a body and an integrating body. And that in some sense, the absence of that in Islam makes tradition in a strange kind of way less central in Islam than it is in Christianity. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So first to nomocracy, not nomotheology, nomocracy. Nomos, means law, Greek word, yeah. So nomocracy, so this term is used by many scholars to describe the power of law in Muslim societies. One of them was Majid Khadduri. I think he taught here. John Hopkins. Okay, so sorry for that. And also there are other scholars who describe Islamic social system, or the Muslim social system, let's say, because Islam as a religion does not propose a system. So this is what Muslims produced. So they describe it as a nomocracy instead of theocracy. So this is how they define. And production of law, as you said, was a civilian effort of the ulama. So the state is not the legislator, and the head of the state was not the legislator. So the ulama produced laws through ijtihad, through issuing fatwa and other things, until the modern period. So for the first time...
Yes, but I'm talking about the role of the caliph or the sultan in relation to that role of law as civil law, because surely that's the other half of the political situation.
Yes, yes. So for the first time, in the second half of the 19th century, the state, under the Khalifa, decided to codify Islamic law and make a standard law and not allow diversity of fatwas and ijtihads. So this was called Majalla. So the Majalla was the first codified Islamic law, and the Khalifa ordered that this should be practiced all over the Ottoman Empire. And Islamic law gives this power to the ruler to choose one of the legal opinions of the scholars and make it the positive law of the land. So using this power, he adopted the modern practice of law. So this is what he did. And then the issue of multiplexity, I use multiplexity as an alternative to multiplicity. So multiplicity is adopted by postmodernist discourse, and it leads to relativism. But multiplexity does not lead to relativism. It recognizes the place of relativism at one particular level, but at another level there is ultimate truth. So it accommodates ultimate truth along with relative truth. So traditionally, this was called maratib al-wujud, in Islamic philosophy, the levels of existence, which I call multiplex ontology, and also maratib al-ulum, which I translate as multiplex epistemology, and eventually it leads to maratib al-haqa'iq, multiplex truth, because the truth also has different levels. So I just wanted to clarify this, and the relationship between formal authority and charismatic authority. The mediating ground was methodology of Islamic law. So they all followed the same methodology, the same interpretive methods, but they arrived to different conclusions. So what legitimated those contesting views was the common methodology which they used. So if they didn't follow this common methodology, the legal opinion would be unacceptable, invalid. So as long as you follow this common methodology, if you arrive to a different legal opinion, it's respected and it's valid, and there is a universal law that one ijtihad cannot invalidate another ijtihad. So a scholarly opinion cannot invalidate another scholarly opinion as long as it's properly pursued within the framework of the methodology of Islamic law. So this was the mediating ground, or the common ground, which enabled them to speak to each other.
Thank you.
Well, I've been asked to announce that the midday Muslim prayer will be at 1:30. And I think there will be somebody to guide you. It is actually in this building, but you can't get there from here without going outside.
We need the authority to take us there.
You will need non-scholarly authority on this. And you've all been wonderfully patient through a long morning, and we should thank our speakers for